Hello, very beautiful community. Our democracies are really rocky, and that's making us freak out politically and personally. So, to help ourselves ground ourselves a bit epistemically, let's read a beautiful, very short Substack by Michael Ignatieff about the decline of US democracy. You know that a lot of what I do, mostly on this platform here and on the main channel, is about conveying not just an intellectual understanding, but a certain kind of embodied bit of wherewithal toward what's happening to us politically. And you know that I am pessimistic about political trends and tendencies objectively, but that I believe in our power of agency. And I also feel not just hopeful, but in some respects, even magically optimistic about our future. The reason I feel like that is largely because I don't compare what's happening to us now in virtue of where we have been in our recent historical past. I compare where we are now to the past in general, and by the standards of that, there is a lot to get going with and a lot to be hopeful about, despite negative tendencies which we can inflect but not control. Okay, enough, Michael, now. As the wise woman Joni Mitchell once sang, you don't know what you've got till it's gone. As a melancholy instance of this, you might not even know what democracy is, or care about it very much, until you see it dismantled before your disbelieving eyes. It's a crucial feature of a democratic system, for example, that officers of the law, executive officials appointed to oversee law enforcement, prosecution services, justice departments owe their allegiance not to the president who appointed them, but to the law that is their duty to enforce. In a democracy, they're supposed to refuse a president's request to prosecute a supposed enemy of his, unless there is clear legal evidence requiring them to do so. So now that the president has ordered the entire legal branch of the US government to prosecute his enemies, whether or not there are any grounds, at least we're reminded of what democracy is supposed to be. This is not much consolation, but it is better, after all, to be slapped awake than left asleep when the house is on fire. And it's rude to interrupt the piece and start commenting before we've read it to completion, but that's just what we're going to do. There is a lot in that last sentence from Michael. Yeah, you want to be awake, not asleep when your house is on fire. Because, first of all, there is very little still in our culture intellectual recognition that our democracies are in decline. Then the people who intellectually recognize that our democracies are in decline tend to not psychically accept it. They haven't yet got into that proper dance of balancing acceptance with refusal to accept. And then, over and above that, there are people, an even smaller minority, who do get it intellectually, who have psychically accepted it, but who don't know what to do about it. And in a kind of depoliticized paralysis because it's not clear how to act. So I would say that proper, widespread social acceptance of the tip into democratic decline that occurred in the early 2010s onwards will only be properly grasped by our cultures at large by the middle 2030s, right? So we don't get it, and we're not on the edge of getting it. So it's a powerful sentence from Michael because it takes us to the core of this predicament, but we've got to be realistic about it. We're asleep as a culture, and we're going to stay asleep because our rate of waking up is very, very, very slow indeed. Now, I think there's also something else here that's really important. And that's the interconnection between people freaking out politically and people freaking out personally. And I do, as some of you know, very small amount of consulting that often works on people's political and ethical self-development. And I'm seeing a lot of very successful professionals lapse into a kind of freak out where you can't tell apart the professional freak out from the personal freak out. We saw, just to take one example, an enormous amount of professional freak out, people losing their rudder professionally, people stopping being able to read historical events around them soberly, people complying preemptively without a need. We saw a lot of that in the sort of diffuse humanitarian catastrophe that the United States caused by cutting USAID. But what's distinctive today, and I actually think that arguably women are more immune from this than men, is a kind of personal unraveling that's accompanied by the political unraveling. And that's very, very dangerous. It's very, very dangerous because when you personally unravel, you don't just get less good quality private life, less good quality marriage, less good quality relationship with your children, less good quality career. You also become a less effective citizen. So that we have a crisis in our culture, including specifically a crisis of men, is a political problem too. It's a political problem because the extreme depoliticization of our citizens, the poverty of our self-help cultures too, the consumerist and fake embrace of spirituality that is rife in our culture, all of that is not disconnected from Trumpism, not just because it's partly a cause of Trumpism, but also because it's partly the same thing as Trumpism. I often talk about a term called hyper-neoliberalism. And hyper-neoliberalism is when historically neoliberalism drifts from being what it is, which is a kind of a magical way of putting primacy on the market, to being a kind of justification of all unbounded competition beyond just market competition, a competition of all against all in which the notion of might is right is normalized. So this is an enormous historical stretch, so I'll just make it as an assertion. But the might is right hyper-neoliberal politics of Orban, Putin, and Trump is not disconnected from a disenchanted, left-wing, 50-year-old single man on dating apps in a bogus way embracing Buddhism. Let's go on. In a democracy, police officers wear badges and uniforms and keep their faces uncovered so that citizens can identify them if they wish to lodge a complaint about how they've been treated. When the police seek entry to an office or private house, they have to have a warrant. We might have forgotten all these essential legal safeguards of a democracy had it not been for the sudden presence on America's streets of hooded figures without badges or identifying insignia, bundling foreign students or workers who cannot produce documents into unmarked cars for transshipment to detention and deportation. The rule of law is one of those abstractions that we rarely bother to make concrete and real. Now it is real enough, because we now know what the country begins to look like when it is shredded, and not as it sometimes is, though individual misconduct. I'm so sorry, I'm going to try this sentence again. Now it is real enough because we now know what the country begins to look like when it is shredded, and not as it sometimes is through individual misconduct, but this time as a dedicated policy of an entire administration. The only thing politically here, much less psychologically now, I want to say, is about the imperceptible, like water coming to the boil, expansion of the politics of enemies. that these new monarchist, hyper-neoliberal, somewhat fascistized regimes that are coming to be dominant in the West this decade, but next decade above all, the expansion of the politics of enemies they practice is perniciously gradual, right? Shifting from illegal folks to resident non-citizens, to particular kinds of citizens who are less than other citizens. This circle of the enemy within imperceptibly grows, and you're meant to either be in fear for how you're going to provide for your family and not notice, or in fear of paying too much attention to politics because you are personally comfortable, and so you just go on and shop as your politics declines. Rule of law depends, as America's founding fathers often said, on the virtue of its defenders, on the willingness of legal officers, from judges to patrolmen on the beat, to stand up for the law. It also depends on the willingness of these officers to stand up for their institutions. The future of the rule of law in the United States now depends on whether the justices of the Supreme Court remember what virtue is, but even more, whether they understand that history will not forgive them if they fail to defend the Supreme Court itself from a president who thinks he has it in his pocket. Now, it's very important when we reflect on our predicament that the strength of our institutions, for all of its disconcerting fragility right now in the United States, is what's going to keep the show on the road for us more than democratic culture. And one of the things that Michael is trying to do with this piece is reawaken us to democratic culture. But we are witnessing a period of decay of democratic culture for reasons of social forces, not for reasons of some kind of intellectual error or moral failure. And it's largely going to be institutions that are going to keep us going. And when it comes to institutional resilience, actually the United States is one of the strongest Western democracies. It's the most sick democracy at the level of democratic culture, but at the level of the capacity of its institutions to keep the show on the road, it's stronger. It's not a simple democracy where there is one institution you can cancel and then you basically reach a point where you can't be kicked out of office. It's more complex in the United States, and we're going to be grateful for that. An additional feature of democracy we've forgotten is that its armed forces are supposed to protect citizens from foreign enemies, not police its streets. And here we've got to be very aware of just how radically evacuating of trust it is to direct your military on your own citizens inward. You rapidly lose trust in the military as an institution, which is a very toxic thing for democracy to experience. Fear that standing armies might be used by a tyrant to subvert democracy was a leading feature of all Whig 18th century political philosophy. I'm going to take a quick health break now and be with you in a moment. And we are back. Fear that standing armies might be used by a tyrant to subvert democracy was a leading feature of all Whig 18th century political philosophy. And the Whigs are not just a political party, but carriers of a certain language of liberty, which is very important to us, even though we can dispute with one another what exactly its shape is. How badly do I misbehave at this point? Let me misbehave for 2 minutes. You will allow me to misbehave for 2 minutes, right? For more misbehavior, you can just go on the philosophy channel. So there are many voices about this, and one very important minority voice, the voice of the intellectual historian Quentin Skinner, puts a very big emphasis on freedom as non-domination. freedom as somehow not being in the power of somebody else, whether that somebody else is exercising that power over you or not. And that contrasts sharply with the tradition that starts with Hobbes, which puts front and center coercion. Coercion that gets then more refined and elaboratedly defined by Locke and then in turn by Bentham. But the entire conversation is about other agents or institutions interfering with you. The conversation that has this kind of neo-Roman emphasis on non-domination that Quentin Skinner cares about is about the power others have over you, whether they are exercising it or not. So a good example today might be the state of social media. Imagine that Elon Musk tomorrow decided that he would outsource the algorithm to some kind of responsible non-governmental committee or some kind of e-court or whatever. Even if Musk's handling of the Twitter algorithm became much more responsible, the fact that it would be in his power just to take the algorithm back and do whatever he wants with it the next day, that would still constitute a kind of problem, as I would agree it is with Quentin Skinner, or as Quentin Skinner would say, a kind of unfreedom, and here I wouldn't necessarily agree with him. Skinner's intellectual enemy, my hero Isaiah Berlin, would accept Skinner's concern with non-domination, would accept that it's three-dimensionally present in our culture as a tradition, right? So when Quentin Skinner finds elements of neo-Roman republicanist thought in John Stuart Mill, Berlin wouldn't say, no, it's not there. But where Berlin would stop short is to say that it is as a political concern that's importantly available to us and should be run through the value of liberty. For Berlin, it's an important concern, but it should be run through other political values. What's the point of all of this really interesting stuff if you're into a little bit of political philosophy or gibberish that I've produced now, if you're not? It's that a culture is FUCK'd if it can't talk about itself, about what freedom is constructively. Okay, shut up, read on. American founding fathers had these texts on their library shelves. Now we have standing armies patrolling the streets of Washington and Chicago. Thank you, Michael, is grounding us much more after my detours. Patrolling the streets of Chicago, Washington, Portland, and whichever city a president decides should feel the weight of his power. Once again, Americans seem to have forgotten what the 18th century had understood only too well. Any democracy is in danger when its leaders are able to deploy armed forces to control their citizens. Right? Applause here, no comment. Another, even less obvious pillar of democracy, one that most of us never think about, is that democratic freedom depends on the right of institutions to govern themselves free of political control. And we've got to be very clear about this. There was on the ex-conservative right a turn against hyper-identity politics, against wokeism. And as far as it goes, it's impeccable. But what's happened is it's now taken on a very, very deformed shape. The benign version of it is impeccable because there really was a problem with institutional capture in recent years in the West by a strange and fleeting ideology that's dying, somewhat hyperactive death, but dying now. And its features were that it made political disagreement moral disagreement, that it made moral disagreement a matter of identity, and that it made the matter of identity a matter of something that institutions actually need to take a side on, and that it made it not just something that institutions need to take a side on, but that something that institutions need to inculcate in their members, including their future members. That's all toxic. And we have had that toxicity dominating liberal media, dominating institutions. However, today, 95% of the anti-woke messages you come across from the right, but especially the ex-right, conservatives who are no longer conservatives, but in fact are authoritarians dressed in conservative clothes, the feature of their anti-woke messaging is that it's no longer just an opposition to hyper-identity politics. It's actually an opposition to various values that are prerequisite for any kind of decent democratic life today. So sociologically, the majority of anti-woke today is a moral disgrace, is a toxic authoritarian moral disgrace that is actually more dangerous than the toxicity of the original wokeism it may have, to begin with, genuinely opposed. Now, there is not just one democracy in a democracy, but many. Beautiful. With each institution, from grand and famous universities right down to parent-teacher associations who practice self-government in conformity with the law, but not under direction from a central authority. That's what the wise French observer de Tocqueville thought was so distinctive about America in the 1830s. When the regime presents American universities with a compact, a contract that promises to restore the funding of their labs and their research on condition that their members abstain from actions or speech relating to societal and political events, and eliminate programs of persons who purposefully punish, belittle, or even spark violence against conservative values, the regime is not simply attacking university freedom, right? This is not legitimate anti-wokeism. This is authoritarianism. It's attacking the whole idea of America as a democracy of democracies, and as a vast, unruly archipelago of free institutions that give themselves their own constitutions, rule themselves within the law, and uphold the project, their values, religious, secular, crazy, sane, whatever the case may be. Now, it's very important that the university, and in fact, expertise as such, is itself an institution, a counter-majoritarian institution in our society, one among others, right? It's part of what Michael calls, power, checking power to keep the people free. And what I want to say specifically here, and you know that I think this, that I think that it's not just that this is true, but that a society needs to hold it in a kind of recalcitrant, three-dimensional way as a truth if it's to go on as keeping its democracy. And it's that you don't get a democracy fundamentally to last unless it is somehow institutionally tethered to the practiced virtue of truthfulness, right? Here I reject as completely unserious, right, the relativistic liberalism of writers like Richard Rorty. Untether yourself from truthfulness, lose your democracy, basically. And that's why members of the Academy, and I am a sort of off-duty member of the Academy for health reasons, have got to be extremely humble, but also extremely bold and assertive about what kind of a central role the institution they represent stands for. In its battle with the universities, the administration does not hesitate to portray Harvard, the Ivy League, as corrupted defenders of privilege, entitlement, and liberal correctness. The only riposte likely to get a hearing with citizens at large must be that they're not defending just themselves, but that the right, sorry, Michael is just saying more eloquently what I've said, but the right of every institution in the United States to be self-governing. The worst of it is that all of this relentless dismantling of democracy is justified in the name of freedom. Back to our conversation about the importance of conversations about freedom. To free students from liberal political correctness, to emancipate us from the supposed scourge of illiberal immigration, to restore safety on the streets and so on. It is astonishing to hear the word freedom deployed to justify its opposite, right? And here you think of the tenets of Russian propaganda, right? Doubt about truth itself, to take your instinct to not get duped and convert it into a general sort of chronic skepticism of truth itself, to forgo consistency, to saturate the informational environment with an ill-assorted set of messages which say that up is down and down is down and up is up, but up is also down and sideways is also up and sideways is sideways, but it's also down. So sort of volume flooding, and then tailor this sort of ill-assorted post-truth salad to somehow be directed with sensitivity to particular microcosms, so that you actually speak to people's motivational internality rather than try to persuade them in something they don't really believe. That's how Russian propaganda roughly works. Watch for a partial toxification of our discourse by that sort of thing domestically produced. Last paragraph. So before it's too late, and before we forget what democracy ever was, it's important to rally around the definition of self-government that used to be the common inheritance of the right and left, conservative, liberal, and progressive. In this definition, democracy is a system of limited government in which power checks power to keep the people free. Michael's favorite phrase. The purpose of democracy is freedom, understood as self-government, freedom from domination, and the right to pursue whatever strange idea of the good and true you happen to believe, provided you remain within the bounds of the law. Democracy is not majority rule, not mob rule, but majority rule balanced by law, rights, the counter power of free institutions, from mighty universities right down to the humble sports club and parent-teacher association. Such an idea of democracy is a friend neither to liberal overreach nor to conservative counter-revolution. It is only a friend to freedom, and if we can't agree to defend it together, we'll lose it piece by piece, and brother, we'll notice it when it's gone. Well, in 2035 we'll notice. I think that this intellectual attempt to awaken us is very constructive and very important. However, it can only have limited power when Michael says these things, when other people say these things, when we say these things on the channels. Because the problem is not that people cognitively, intellectually fail to grasp this. The problem rather is that people don't develop political commitments unless there are commensurate avenues for political action. And so what that means in practice is that people are not going to wake up to the fact that we're losing democracy in virtue of just being reminded that we're losing democracy. They're going to wake up to the fact that we're losing democracy only if you offer, actually, a package of civic renewal that speaks to people based on the values of solidarity and patriotism, and offers some kind of political renewal and economic renewal, right? Economic democratization. So unless you get that kind of project of renewal, you're really talking to very small numbers of people who may change their minds or become alert. So we're largely in a shop talking to ourselves here. The only way to break out of that is to tie the kinds of things Michael is saying to actual politics, an actual political project offering something. Unless people feel they can do something about their boat that's sinking, they're going to look away from the fact that their boat is sinking. So it's sort of consciousness of the capacity to make change. Right. Thank you so much for being with me. On the weird off chance you haven't seen my main channel video from a few weeks ago on what it is that constitutes this ideology that Putinism and Trumpism share, I'll put that up here. But I think most of you have already seen it. So in that case, just see you next time on the chat channel, and lots of love.